Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I can see quite a few of you have already found the attendee chat, but while we're giving people another minute or so to join, please hop in and tell us where you're joining us from today. I see South Africa, Germany, Finland, Puerto Rico, Florida. I'm seeing a lot of Europe and United States, but this is incredible. So yeah, just drop in and share where you're joining from. I am just outside of Denver, Colorado, and we finally have a crisp fall morning, and I am loving it so far. What about you, Tom? Where are you joining us from today?
Seattle, Washington, and it is a gray and rainy day, just like it always is here.
Not too bad. Mm-hmm. And then, Steve, what about you? Where are you joining us from?
I am also in the Pacific Northwest, and I am a little south of Tom in just outside of Portland, Oregon.
Oh, nice.
And it is also gray and dreary today.
I will say, my one time in the Pacific Northwest, it was sunny the entire time, so I felt a little let down.
Yeah. You know, I was doing everything I could just to discourage, with the whole gray and dreary thing. And we're all taught to make sure to tell everyone that it's terrible here. Nobody wants to live here. And so it's all part of a plot.
It's a good tactic. Mm-hmm. All right. We have a few more people in, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Molly, and I'm a member of the staff at the Scrum Alliance, and I am incredibly excited to welcome you to today's webinar, Unlocking Value, Transforming Metrics with Goal-Driven Strategies. We are incredibly proud to partner on this webinar with Hyperdrive, who is one of our training partners, and it has been a delight working with them. So for those of you who maybe are unfamiliar with the Scrum Alliance, or you only learned about the Scrum Alliance after getting a certification, I wanted to give a little bit of an intro. We are the first of our kind not-for-profit serving a global community of professionals. We partner with world-class trainers to provide in-demand professional certifications. We were established in 2001, shortly after the signing of the Agile Manifesto. And since we were established, we have issued over 1,876,000 certifications. And our mission is to advance real-world agility by equipping and inspiring the change maker in everyone. If you're a Scrum Alliance member or you're looking at getting your first Scrum Alliance certification, you can look forward to some pretty cool member benefits. We have access to exclusive content on our website, connection to our wonderful global community through events such as this, as well as discounts to our regional Scrum gatherings and global Scrum gatherings. If you keep an eye out in the next few weeks, we'll be opening registration for our global Scrum gathering in Munich next year, and we'd love to see as many of you there as possible. You also get access to tools such as the Retrium retrospective tool and the comparative agility tools. Before we get started, I just want to give you a quick tour of the console you'll be using today for the webinar. First thing I want to point out is the Q&A box. Throughout our presentation, if you have any questions for Tom, our wonderful speaker, please drop them in the Q&A box, and we will do a moderated Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Another thing I wanted to point out is the related content section, where you can download the slide deck from today, as well as check out both of our websites. Most of you have found it, and that is our attendee chat box where you can connect with your fellow attendees. And finally, we have reactions that you can throw up during this event, whether you want to do a thumbs up, a smiley face, a clap, or a celebration. We'd love to see your reactions throughout. Just a reminder that this webinar is recorded, and you will receive a link to the on-demand recording tomorrow midday-ish, as well as a link to claim your Scrum Education Unit for attending this event. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Steve, one of our partners at Hyperdrive.
Thanks, Molly. Appreciate that. Hey, welcome, everyone. We're glad you're here. I'm Steve Claus, SVP of Business Transformation at Hyperdrive. When I transitioned from industry and started my Agile consulting journey, nearly a decade ago now, Tom was my first manager and mentor at Rally Software. So I was super blessed that he took me under his wing, and I certainly wouldn't be where I am today without him. So to brag about Tom a little bit, Tom's a longtime Agilist, trainer, coach, and he currently serves as Hyperdrive's chief trainer and lead enterprise agile transformation coach. Tom also leads our training course innovation practice, and he's responsible for creating and earning certification for all new Hyperdrive courses that we roll out. I always learn a lot when Tom's speaking, so you're definitely in for a treat today. Please welcome my good friend and my colleague, Tom Perry.
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate it. My goodness, I'm a little red and flustered. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So I wanted to start off today to share a little bit of a story. So there was an engagement I was on, a company I was working with, where we had agile teams. Everybody was doing Scrum. Everything was going reasonably well, but for some reason, when we were working with a legacy product, we didn't have many tests that went out with the code. And so as a group of folks who were interested in sort of increasing the agility of those teams, we thought, well, we should have a new metric. And let's call that metric, let's call it running tested features. And these running tested features will be anytime that a new feature goes out the door, there should be a test, a unit test associated with that always runs. Now, on the face of it, this sounded like a fantastic idea. From now on, every feature that goes out the door will have a test associated with it, and we will have increasing amounts of automation, increasing amounts of testing going on, and our quality should go up. And so we introduced this metric, the RTF metric, and we asked our Scrum Masters to keep track of it from team to team. And lo and behold, we found that the number went up. Yay! Success! We have introduced a new metric, and the metric is going up. And then one day, one of the Scrum Masters comes to me and says, Tom, that metric is fake. What the developers are doing is every time they write a feature, they will write a test, and the test always passes. The test always succeeds. It's basically a fake test, and they simply copy and paste that test and use it with every feature that they produce. So all of the data that you're getting back that tells you that this metric is succeeding is actually dead wrong. Of course, this was a huge challenge for us, and this was one of my first introductions to the complexity of trying to introduce tests in an agile environment. And so with that in mind, there are a few things that I've learned along the way. And one is that there are some challenges here. One of those challenges is probably one that you've seen yourself, which is if you start to measure teams on something like velocity, what's the first thing that happens? The size of the story point estimates might start to grow. You might start getting larger story point estimates. And it turns out this is described as something called Goodhearts Law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Well, obviously, my idea for the RTF, the running tested feature, was also subject to this property. The other thing you see is anything you measure, stories per sprint, for example, would lead to lots and lots of tiny stories. So teams and human beings in general are really, really good at gaming the system, and they know it when you're trying to introduce a new metric. So another problem here is called Campbell's Law, which is when you put pressure on something, when you start to measure people and say, look, we're going to use this to assess you in some way that might affect, your decision making or some social attribute, then it starts to corrupt the measure as well. So if we insist on more productivity, then we will measure, releases. And so that's what we did. I joined a team at a company, and that I was told by my manager that that team only released 4 times per year. And I said, okay, no problem. Scrum Master, I joined the team. A year later, we have delivered 38 times in a year. and people are pulling me over in the hallway saying, "Oh my God, how did you do it? That's fantastic." And I felt pretty good. But then the UX guy took me out one day and he says, "You know, Tom, all of these releases, all of these tiny little releases that you're delivering and that your team is getting credit for, they really don't mean much. I miss the good old days. I miss the days when we had a big release that had value. It had something that the customer cared about. And I just don't care anymore." And so one of the consequences is that we got really good at pumping out lots of stuff. So we were more productive, but it was really acquiescing to that pressure. And so we started to put out a lot more low quality features, and our customers, as a result, were not seeing things they cared about, not seeing things that they valued. And that's called Campbell's Law. Another variation on this theme is the observer effect, which is that when you're monitoring a metric, oftentimes that'll subtly influence people to maximize that measure. When I first started off in tech support, the management team made it very, very clear in tech support that we were measured on the number of calls per day that we took. And so, being a savvy young individual at the time, I became an expert at answering calls super duper fast. And so I drove that number up. I was answering 70, 80 calls a day, no problem at all. Were my customers happy? No, not necessarily, because I was answering the call as fast as I could without any concern or real empathy for what their needs were at the time. That was an example of the observer effect. I knew what my management was looking for. I knew what number they were watching, and I had no difficulty satisfying that. So these are some of the consequences, the impacts of poor metrics. And I think this diagram here shares it well. There are a lot of consequences that go along with this. So you can have things like ineffective development if you measure the wrong things, misguided decision-making, customer dissatisfaction, wasted resources, wasted time and energy, misalignment with business goals, poor employee morale. It goes on and on. So the consequences are actually quite severe for mismanaging metrics. And to be honest with you, I think I see that happen more often than not these days. And so this is, I think, the reason it's so important to focus on this and get this right, because it is so challenging. And one of the consequences of this is when I realized that RTF metric that I was talking about, when I realized that had gone astray, when the teams were cheating it, when they were basically coming up with fake data for me in order to satisfy that metric, the first thing I did was go to my management team and say, the running tested feature metric is a failure. It's not working. We need to stop doing it now. They looked at me and said, well, Tom, you must be doing it wrong. And they refused to get rid of the metric. And so then I thought, well, what do I do about this? So I started faking the data, and I drove the numbers up and I drove the numbers down. And guess what I discovered? No matter what the data did, the management team took no action. And so I drove the numbers artificially high and artificially low and artificially high and artificially low. And one day we had a meeting and they said, oh, look at that. The numbers have gone up again. And I looked at them and said, well, that's because they're fake. And at that point, they realized that none of this information was really being used. And one of the key things that we need to do is have metrics that lead to effective decision-making. And so without that, it's very, very difficult for anything to get accomplished. And you get a lot of these poor impacts. So with that in mind, what we want to do is align with business goals. So what we're after here is starting to focus more on value delivery, making sure that we have folks aligned together that we have collaboration across teams, and that we're focusing on what's going to keep the business alive and healthy, and that we're focusing on things like agility and adaptability. These are the key things we need to do, and these are the things that oftentimes get left out because we tend to focus on the team or other suboptimal areas. We need to be looking at the whole system, the whole enterprise, and asking ourselves, how can we make a difference to the business and to our customers? And so that means that we need to be rethinking metrics and how we use them in agile contexts. All too often, what we see is that agile frameworks emphasize the team. It's all about the team, right? And it's all about the product, oftentimes at the expense of overall business performance. We also see agile metrics are often captured using terms that don't really resonate well for the business. These are terms like story points and velocity that, well, honestly, most executives have no idea what you're talking about. They're talking in completely different terminology, and that mismatch causes problems for us as well. And there can be an overemphasis, just like the trap I fell into, where we can overemphasize output, too much stuff, and not enough outcomes, focusing on, did we actually make a difference? Did we actually change the behavior, impact the lives of our customers? That's what we're after. And so the other thing that I'm sure you've all encountered is that the first thing that happens oftentimes with agile metrics is that they get used across teams. They get used to compare the velocity of team A with the velocity of team B, and all of a sudden bad things start to happen. And so these comparisons, these metrics that were never, ever designed to be used that way, are suddenly being used in ways that actually pervert the original intention of those metrics. So all of this is to say, these are common problems that we see in our agile community that have been around, since, the 90s, if not earlier. And so knowing this, we have to find a better way, a better approach. And Lord knows it's hard. Metrics like quality are really, really hard to kind of wrap your head around. And so they require things like very subjective ways of measuring. And in fact, I would argue they require many different ways of measuring in order to get them right. It's not enough just to look at a single number and assume that is going to give you some sort of realistic assessment of quality. And there are other attributes like that, including things like customer value, which again is notoriously nebulous. So applying traditional metrics to agile teams also fails. And I'm sure you've seen presentations like this before, where you have things like lines of code. Hopefully by now, nobody is measuring their team in terms of lines of code. But this was the old way of doing these things. Back when I was first a developer in the 1990s, lines of code was still a conversation. Number of bugs fixed, again, single number, very deceptive, oftentimes used to assess quality and oftentimes fails dramatically. Utilization rates. This is why we have time tracking systems. And these things are awful. They measure just about nothing useful. And they're horribly inaccurate because they are super easy to game. The adherence to initial estimates, are we on time, right? On-time performance is, reasonably speaking, it is important, but is it the most important thing? Absolutely not. Oftentimes, is this the right thing to do? Is this the thing that will make a difference? Is much more important. So percent complete, again, very deceptive. We really want to focus on getting things complete. We're really not interested in finding out that things are half done. So these are all examples of how traditional metrics, when applied to agile teams, really do sort of fall down. So what we need are more adaptable, more goal-oriented metrics. We want to focus on the outcomes, the customer value. We want metrics that are changeable. I want to see metrics that are different this month than next month and the month after that. I want to see metrics that adapt. That tells me that the business and our priorities are changing, which is exactly what should happen in an agile environment. Goal-oriented metrics will help us keep the right balance between the focus on long-term and short-term gains, and goals help preserve our alignment with the business, which honestly, for the longest time, we've failed to do. And it's one of the reasons that I think Agile sometimes struggles, is because we aren't properly aligned with the goals of the business. So with that in mind, what can we do? The foundation here, I think, is that we use goal setting at the very beginning here. We have to understand where we're starting from. That's key. So we want to set very clear, actionable goals. And there's a framework for this, and you're probably familiar with it, called OKRs. And so this is one example. You could use any goal-setting framework, but OKRs is probably one of the best established mechanisms that's around today. And this allows us to set our objectives. Where do we want to go? What do we intend to do? And it's got to be something that's meaningful, that's big, that's inspiring. And it also, the nice thing about OKRs is that they're constrained. We try and keep a limit on these things. So we're not just spawning off a bunch of them. And they are easy for everyone to understand. This is at a high level. This is at an organizational level here. And so we want to have objectives that are going to be annual, multiple timeframes here. And then the other thing that's important here, and this gets back to the measurement, is it starts to talk about the key results. What are the outcomes which we're going to try and measure success by? We need to have 4 to 6 of those. What I like about this is that we are using multiple measures, multiple metrics that we can use to assess our performance on this goal. And this allows us to have a more rich and complete picture of what success looks like for a given objective. It also means we can keep things quantifiable. And so this is, I think, a healthy starting point. Now, if we look at OKRs a little bit further, the thing that I like the best, and this is what's lost a lot of the time, is that they're actually a framework. OKRs need to be scaled across the organization. Otherwise, they really don't look any different than any other SMART objective. So the thing with OKRs is they need to be shared. And so it's not enough. I wouldn't want anyone to rush out and start making OKRs for their team and think they're doing it right. Instead, what I'd want them to do is have an OKR that maybe applies across multiple teams, or maybe applies across multiple divisions in the organization. The intent of an OKR is to bring people together broadly across the organization. And so these are not a goal-setting mechanism that just kind of trickles down to individuals. That's wrong. What OKRs are intended to do is bring people together and focus them on what's important to the organization. And if we can do that, that suddenly is creating that alignment that I was hoping for. If we can use OKRs to do that, then we can get people pointed in the same direction. And now we have the established set of measures that we can use with our teams. And so this is where I think using the OKRs across the organization is very beneficial. And so thinking of OKRs more as a framework, then we can use it at the strategic level. we've got to be thinking in terms of our strategic planning, our annual planning that we're doing. They're a new way of expressing sort of the outcomes of that strategic planning process. They give us a way to align across the organization. They give us more clarity on what the outcomes are. They're very outcome oriented, and they help us make important decisions. And I love the quote here. Someone says, unshared OKRs are like uneaten pizzas. They look good, but miss the point. That's beautiful. Organizational clarity. They help us identify where we should work together, and maybe even more importantly, where we're not working together. And so it's finding those pinch points, finding those areas where we're not aligned, where we really improve the value. And then, of course, having that common shared commitments with other groups, teams. And it means, I think, that sometimes we have to restructure ourselves. If at its most meaningful, OKRs aren't superficial. They aren't just, hey, we're all working towards this. OKRs should push us to look at the way we're structured and say, do we have the right people? Do we have the right focus? Do we have everything we need? And if not, how do we restructure ourselves to do that? In some ways, that's really at the heart of business agility. And so with that radical idea in mind, here's an example of an OKR. The objective, create an awesome customer experience. Some key results. Well, we can use the familiar Net Promoter Score. I'm sure many folks have heard of NPS. We could increase our repurchasing rate. Now, repurchasing rate is, well, that's more of a product-oriented metric. And maintaining customer acquisition cost. Again, something that has to do with the product and where that product is in its product life cycle. That's where we're starting from here. And that is using goal-oriented thinking and just a splash of product thinking to identify the metrics that are the most important. Knowing this, we can have a good conversation about how the team should focus and what the team should focus on. And then we have some metrics here. We will create an awesome customer experience as measured by improving the Net Promoter Score, the repurchase rate, the customer acquisition. So with this, another example, our objective, delight our customers, very ambitious. Key results, reduce revenue churn. Increase, another Net Promoter Score example, average weekly visits per user, increase non-paid traffic. So this might be something that's using like a freemium model or something like that. And so we're using a different set of measures. And again, we can quantify specific measures as our targets, but it's multiple measures, not single measures. With this in mind, we have some practical ideas here for measuring success. And when I say practical, what I'm thinking of is I was recently working on some product management training, and I realized that one of the things that I failed to ask in the past is, where is my product on the product life cycle? Because that could have a huge impact on the kinds of things that I care about. If I'm in the introduction phase of the product life cycle, then my challenges are very, very different than if I'm in the maturity phase of the product life cycle. If I'm in the introduction phase, what I'm looking at are things, my needs as a business are creating awareness of the product, building demand for that product, and getting early adopters, right? It's all that customer development stuff. So that's what I'm focused on in the introductory phase. In the growth phase, my emphasis changes a bit. Now I've found some customers and I need to scale up as fast as I can. I need to expand my customer base and I need to build loyalty to this new brand. And then as we get into maturity, I basically need to capture as much market share as I can, and I'm focused on profitability. Now, profitability would have made no sense in the introduction phase, but in the maturity phase, all of a sudden, profitability and revenue become a big deal. So what I'm saying here is that the metrics we keep track of are going to depend on where you are in this life cycle. And of course, finally, in the decline phase, you're looking at cost savings, you're looking at harvesting profits, and you're looking at the path forward to retiring the product and the evolution of the next thing. And so all of these would suggest that the metrics we use are going to vary depending on where we're at for our given products in a given life cycle. The product type is also an element here. It's also a factor here. If it's physical goods, services, digital products, ideas, events, experiences, these are all different categories of product types. Now, I'm guilty of really living in that digital products domain, right? I'm a software guy. That is where I have looked at the majority of my career, what kind of products and what kind of metrics I think about. But if you look at services, for example, all of a sudden, the kinds of things, the kinds of activities, the kinds of measures that you use start to change. And so the same applies to experiences, events, and ideas. And some of this is me sort of pulling back and saying, look, Scrum and Agile were great for digital products, but now we're applying them much more broadly across many different domains, and the way we measure things in those domains has to change as well. The product delivery model also comes into play. Maybe you're looking at something that's traditional retail, e-commerce versus subscription. It could be direct to consumer, on demand, freemium. Depending on which kinds of product delivery model you have, the metrics you use are going to be very, very different. And so if you have teams that are using a model that is a traditional e-commerce model, then you're going to be having things like SEO, working on optimization, search optimization. User experience might be a big part of that. In a traditional retail model, you have stores and merchandise and inventory to worry about. In a freemium model, you would have things like upgrade triggers. When do we know we can move from the free model to the paid model? And in premium models, we might have things like customer segments that we're going after. So understanding the delivery model also tells us important things about what we care about in terms of metrics. The metrics are going to depend on the kind of product delivery model you have, the kind of product type, and where that product fits in the overall product life cycle or evolution. And so the idea here is that now we want to try and take some of this and go from theory into practice. And so with that, the big challenges here are really making this work in your organization. And the first thing is we have to do it in a way that feels safe for the teams. And so we have to make safety a prerequisite here. If it threatens people, if it threatens their employment or their compensation, then it's not safe. If it makes them look bad in any way, it's not safe. So one of the ways we can do this is give these metrics to the team. One of the big mistakes I made was trying to impose metrics on others. Anytime you're imposing metrics on teams, you're liable to get in trouble. So they need to have a voice in this. They need to come up with measures that they feel address the problem. They need to feel like they are the ones who own this. It can't be externally imposed. Start small. One of the problems we have in a lot of organizations is we have too many metrics, and a lot of them are garbage metrics. And so keep it small. Drop a metric when it's no longer useful. This I love. This is fantastic. Get rid of metrics. And the idea here is maybe give it an expiration date. Maybe it should have, because for some reason, organizations, bureaucracies have a hard time getting rid of a metric once you apply it. That's what that example of the RTF metric was all about. That was me creating a metric, realizing it was a mistake, and then finding out, much to my dismay, that the organization refused to get rid of it. That was astonishing. That was eye-opening. So we want to build an organization that is capable of not only creating metrics, but removing metrics. And so I think it is with activities like these that we're much more likely to be successful with metrics than, the alternative. The challenges are cultural resistance, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, getting leadership buy-in for some of this stuff. I think we're more likely to get it if we use a goal-oriented approach rather than trying to come up with some sort of weird agile metric. It needs to be something that is in terminology that the management is familiar with and comfortable with. We need to be aligned on what the purpose of the metrics are. And we need to have metrics that are both short-term and long-term in their focus. As much as we like to have the short-term focus, we also need the direction of the long-term focus. Anything that helps us increase visibility here is probably a good thing. And of course, we need to balance that blame versus improvement sort of thing. And that comes back to culture. Some cultures, this might be very easy to do. Other cultures, it's next to impossible, given, the different circumstances. So this means that we're probably moving our focus kind of through different areas here of improvement. And it's iterative. It's something we're going to be doing over and over again, constantly refining, because frankly, it's hard. There are a lot of different things we have to take into account. And if the organization would just sit still, just for a second, we could get the perfect set of metrics, but it won't. The organization refuses to sit still. Products and customers do not sit still. They're highly dynamic. And so as a result, our metrics need to be constantly adjusting against this very dynamic background. We need to be emphasizing marketing, satisfaction, revenue, performance. They're all going to be varying throughout the product life cycle and probably influenced by things like economics, politics, and a whole bunch of other confusing factors. So at the end of the day, to bring this all to a conclusion, the key points I want you to take home. We need to align metrics to our business goals. That's the important thing here. And so there are some techniques out here. Scaled OKRs, focusing on product type or delivery model or life cycle, and iterating, trying and trying again, putting expiration dates on your metrics and trying different kinds of metrics, not relying on one metric to do it all for you, and keeping in mind the hazards of getting that wrong. There are some benefits here if we can get this right. We get enhanced focus on value, we get better strategic alignment, we get better collaboration. Hopefully, this leads to competitive advantage, and it also might, just might, lead to increased agility and adaptability. And so with this in mind, I sincerely hope that this pushes us to think beyond the team. I want you to look for those organizational and product goals to help guide you. And I think that's a better way to go. Thank you guys very much for your time, and I am open for questions.
Amazing. Thank you, Tom, for that incredible presentation. Watching the chat during that, I think our audience learned a lot, which is always great to see during a webinar. Let's dive into the questions. Who drives the metrics priorities, the product owner or the Scrum Master?
Ooh, well, I'm going to make the case that the metrics priorities, well, I think it depends. They're kind of different domains. I was actually going to go so far as to say maybe not just the product owner. I would say it even goes higher. In other words, the organization as a whole has some priorities, and the product owner is subordinate to those. In other words, your product may not be the most important product in the organization. It may not be the most important product to survive. Your product may be on the decline, in which case the priorities of your product relative to the business might be low. And we just have to come to accept that that's part of the product life cycle. Within that, of course, yes, the product owner is a major player in understanding value, and I think has major input and may have a set of metrics like NPS, for example, the customer satisfaction scores, that I think would be very appropriate for them to care about. And if you must have an owner, sure, why not? Also, I think it's a little tricky having the Scrum Master own the metrics. I don't like that. I want the team to own the metrics. So the Scrum Master is a coach, and the Scrum Master might advise on, different ideas for metrics, but I don't really want the Scrum Master to be responsible for the metrics. This should be something that's owned by the team as a whole. But that's me. I've got my Birkenstocks and my tie-dyed T-shirt on when I say that. But I really don't think that it's something that is controlled by the Scrum Master.
All right. So how does one keep key results in OKRs from turning into these meaningless metrics mentioned previously?
I don't know. I think you have to practice with them, and again, I'm not a believer that there's a perfect metric, that it's the kind of thing that is you have to do a little trial and error with. It's an experiment, like so many other things. It's an experiment, and I think value is vague enough that sometimes your first attempt is not going to work out, and you need to be ready to iterate and discover more. And so that's why in this presentation you didn't get the authoritative list. And I've had customers ask for this. Customers say, Tom, tell me what to measure. Give me the agile metrics. Give me the answer. And the fact is, I don't know. Context is very, very different. Value is very, very different across these different domains. And oftentimes, to be honest, many organizations don't have a goal-setting mechanism in place. So they really don't have good guidance for you to work with. In other words, if your organization doesn't have good strategy and good goal setting in place now, it's going to be very difficult for you as a team to figure out what's important. And I think that's probably the most pressing concern these days. We need to get organizations to get clear and coherent about their strategy and their goals. And once they do that, once they can articulate that, then we're in good shape.
All right. The next question we have is, how can we support this shift to meaningful metrics when the focus is on quantifiable, easy to read metrics, which really don't tell us anything?
It's hard. It's hard. I think I like to keep it simple. I'll be honest. I really like a metric that is easy, and I think I'm probably like a lot of people that way. And so I'm not going to say that just because it's simple, it is not useful. So I think that there are some simple metrics that can work very, very well. And again, it's a matter of finding the ones that are most useful. For example, look, velocity is a fantastic metric for the team. and for the use that it's applied to within the team, for us understanding how we're performing, it's a great metric. And so I don't want to point at velocity and make it bad. It's great, it's simple, it's easy, it's there for the team. I just want the team to have another metric that tells them, how are we helping the business? How are we making a difference? And that's where I failed in the past. That's where I've seen a lot of teams fail in the past. We could say, hey, we're high performing. That's just part of the answer. It's not enough to be high performing. It's, are we aligned and doing what the business needs the most right now?
All right. So this kind of follows up off of the first question of who owns the metrics. Mm-hmm. While team members should own the metrics, as you pointed out, they are, however, not in leadership positions to reiterate their goals and metrics. That comes from the leadership. If the leadership doesn't believe in adapting to changing needs as per the team's request, there could be a disconnect. How do you recommend tackling situations like that?
Boy, that's challenging. So really what you're talking about is, how do I persuade leadership to adapt or look at more changeable metrics or different kinds of metrics? And this is where I think we can build a case. Look, the consulting approach is that you would look at this and you would ask the question, what are your pain points? Understand the pain points first. Understand what's driving the organization and be able to articulate that. People aren't going to adopt new metrics if they don't see a need, and they're not going to change the style they use with metrics if they don't see the purpose. And so I think they have to feel the pain. If they don't, for instance, I worked for an organization that was a credit card processing company that will not be named. And this company was making money hand over fist. The hard part for this organization wasn't, the hard part was any metric you put out there said that we were rock stars. If you asked them, if you came up with a metric or a new way of doing things, they all went up. We're all making money. We were standing inside of a money tornado. And in a case like that, metrics and getting people to care about metrics, it's actually really hard. Nobody cares. Just start the project, Tom. Just get going, because we'll make money. And so in a case like that, you have to figure out what's their biggest struggle. What is the thing that would make a difference to them? It ain't making money in this particular case. It's much more along the lines of something like, where are we wasting money? Where, you have to look at it a little bit differently. So it's really going to depend. Yeah.
All right. Do you advise reviewing metrics in the daily Scrum meeting or during the sprint or the Scrum retrospective? Is there a time or place that you would recommend reviewing the metrics?
I think for a retrospective, they're great because, of course, and I'm talking about the team level stuff as well as the organizational, but the team level stuff for sure, because it provides one of the things that's often missing in the retrospective, which is data. So it's all too often that retrospectives are purely subjective. How did the last sprint feel? How do we feel about the process? It would be great to have some data, and that's where metrics really come into play. So absolutely in the retrospective. Beyond that, I think that they should also be instituted, and especially this is where the OKRs come into play. When you roll out OKRs in using scaled OKRs, you're basically building structured meeting points into the organization for retrospectives across the organization. And so that's where the real value starts to take place here. It's not just that you have OKRs, but that you have the annual or quarterly or monthly meeting structure in place to be reviewing and assessing these things. And so that's really what you need beyond the team in order for any kind of goal setting mechanism to be effective, any kind of metric review to be effective. And that's why I think it's so important to have a framework like scaled OKRs in place. It's not enough just to have the OKRs. You need all of the supporting people. You need all of the supporting meetings there in a coherent structure so that everybody knows what's going on.
Right. How do you keep transparency in your organization and avoid metric gaming? i.e., if metrics that are known and emphasized are susceptible to gaming, but those are the things you're judging productivity on, how do you make sure your team knows what your requirements are without those metrics becoming useless?
It's hard. It's hard. I remember I had a conversation with the vice president who was a really smart guy, someone I really admired. And he pulled me into his office and said, okay, Tom, I think you're doing great work. But here's the thing. I know the teams are all producing stuff and they're getting better at it, but I need to show the rest of the organization that we're more productive, that we're delivering value. How can I do that? And this is my confession. I kind of blew that conversation because my answer was, well, maybe we can take individual stories and we can give them some sort of value number that somehow would give them a value score, maybe a value point that we associate with each user story. And while that wasn't a necessarily bad idea, it really was missing the point, which is that neither one of us really understood what it meant to really focus on outcomes, and that productivity really wasn't the answer. We were already super productive. We could pump out lots of stuff. We were naturals at that. The thing that we really needed to do, the question that we were both getting wrong, was that it was not about productivity at all. It was about influencing the customer, changing their behavior, changing the way they work, basically changing their lives. And so once you take that approach, then things look very, very different. Can we prevent gaming? In my experience, no. You're going to have a certain amount of gaming take place. Sometimes you can make the gaming work for you. That's one of the things that prioritizations like weighted shortest job first, for example, does a good job of sort of setting up the game so that everybody creates smaller stories. So that's one example of that. But can you stop gaming from happening? No, these are human beings. And so far, I've learned that most teams are smarter than I am.
All right. How would you prevent that the OKRs would not repeat in the next cycle? Delight our customers sounds like something that could be focused on for over a year.
It's a big problem. And I think with OKRs, it's hard because one of the things that people discover very quickly is that setting up the review cycle for OKRs and maintaining them and even coming up with them it's not easy. It requires that you have some understanding of your values and your mission and your vision and your strategy. And to be honest, a lot of organizations really don't have a coherent set of those things in place. And so without that, they go through this long struggle to come up with the OKRs. At the end of it, they've had consultants come in and tell them how to do it. They're exhausted. Thank God we have OKRs. I'm not touching those OKRs for another year because that was a lot of work. And so again, I would go back to, unless you have a framework and people responsible for helping you to maintain those OKRs, to review those OKRs, facilitators who are responsible for making sure you review the OKRs, if you don't have those supporting structures in place, OKRs will sit there and never change. And so, again, I think the framework that we put around it makes a whole lot, is very important.
All right. How would you recommend coaching leadership so they stop comparing teams based on the metrics?
I would recommend a cattle prod. The fact of the matter is that the hardest thing to do is really get people to understand this. And so it's really bringing them to the team And one of the things that I think is often the case with leaders like this is that they have kind of lost contact, lost touch with the team. And so I want to bring them to the team, introduce them to the team. And one of the activities that I often do when I'm coaching is literally take the leader by the hand and say, you know what, this meeting is great, but let's go down the hall and let's just watch the team. I call it going on safari. I even have a groovy little safari hat that I put on, and we're going to go down the hall and we're going to go see what a team actually looks like. We're going to go on a team hunt and we're going to look and see what happens. And then I bring them back to the office and I say, what did you see? What did you actually see happening there? What does an agile team look like? And that usually is a very beneficial conversation.
How would you define and track, actually, how would you define and track user success, not as satisfaction, but as feature engagement? Is it a vanity metric to track several, e.g. flow completion rate, time spent interacting, and qualitative feedback?
Yeah. So I think for some products, like if it's a product that is some sort of e-commerce product or something like that, then you should be looking at a variety of metrics like transactions, number of transactions, average transaction time, you can look at, and you should be experimenting with and asking the question, I wonder what users are doing here. I wonder what drives their interest here. And so it's not, I understand that vanity metrics are a problem, but I wouldn't let that stop me from exploring. So it's, again, I think vanity metrics are we want to avoid them. There's some good, if I were to look for a good set, it would be something like the Google Heart metrics, for example, that would be a good starting point. But I don't think those prevent you from falling victim to the vanity thing. I've used velocity as a vanity metric, so I'm not sure you can completely avoid it.
All right. And we'll go with one final question because we're nearing the end of our time.
All right.
But how do you navigate leadership that does not want to set clear goals or strategy for their organization? I'll try to give you a really easy one to end this up with.
Yeah, if they don't want to, that may be advice to run the other way. But that's hard. That's hard. I think it goes back to, if they don't want to, ask the question, why? Why not? There's probably a very good reason. And so it's a matter of exploring that and examining that further and finding out what they're afraid of. And that could be very useful. Now, how you present that to them, you have to be very careful with. If you do like I did in manipulating the RTF and pushing it up and down, that's not a good career move. Yeah, I think it's one of those things where we ask why.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that Q&A session, and thank you to everybody who threw incredible questions into the Q&A box. As usual, you made it very difficult for me to pick out what questions to ask, and that is always a great problem to have. I'd always rather have far too many questions to try and fit in than not enough. So I want to say another huge thank you to Tom for an incredible presentation. I know there are things I'm going to be bringing back to my team to ask about metrics, what we could measure, what could be more meaningful. And I hope that everybody who attended is walking away with a little something to bring back to their team and their organization.